Good afternoon, as I said, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jovan Kurbalija. I'm an associate professor and the deputy head of the International Relations Department here at Webster, Geneva. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of Webster University, Geneva, and also our campus director, Clementina Sedo, and the head of the International Relations Department, Dr. Oreste Foppiani. This event is on a very topical and important issue, as you know, virtual diplomacy, and we have a very distinguished panel of speakers and an excellent moderator. This event would not have been possible without the cooperation and assistance of Ms. Sidia Joachim, our events coordinator, and Mr. Tim Young, our webmaster. So I thank them both very much for all their efforts and assistance. We have 4 speakers and 1 moderator. And before turning things over to our moderator, Ambassador Michel Vetet, I would like to briefly introduce our participants. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we will have a discussion Q&A session, question and answer session for about half an hour. After the last speaker is done, our events coordinator will open up the chat so you can place your questions on the chat and also indicate if you're directing your question at any particular person. So in terms of our speakers, just very briefly, they have very long and illustrious careers and achievements. Our first speaker is going to be Ambassador Excellency Ambassador Isabel Tichy-Fisslberger. And Ambassador Fiselberger has been the permanent representative of Austria at the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva since 2017. In 2020, she served as the president of the United Nations Human Rights Council. Ambassador Tichy-Fisslberger has a long experience in multilateral affairs, both on the regional and also on the global level. Her previous foreign postings included Dublin, London, and Brussels. And while she was in Vienna, she served inter alia as Director General for Legal and Consular Affairs. She has recently been elected President of the Economic Commission for Europe. So Ambassador Fiselberger will go first. Our second speaker is going to be Mr. Nicholas Hawton. Mr. Nicholas Hawton is the ICRC's diplomatic advisor on the Near and Middle East. So he's quite busy at present, as you can imagine, with all that's going on. Prior to joining the ICRC, he worked as a senior political and communications advisor for the European Union in Libya and the Balkans. He also worked as a foreign correspondent for the BBC and as a writer for the London Times newspaper. He has a BA honors degree in modern history from Oxford University and a master's degree in broadcast journalism. He has written about the increasing importance of virtual diplomacy and the skills and techniques required to engage in it effectively. Our third speaker will be Professor Jovan Kurbalija. Professor Kurbalija is Executive Director of DiploFoundation and head of the Geneva Internet platform. He has been a pioneer of cyber diplomacy since 1992, when he established the Unit for Information Technology and Diplomacy at the Mediterranean Academy of Diplomatic Studies in Malta. Between 2018 and 2019, Professor Kurbalija served as the co-executive director of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation. And previously, he was a member of the high-level multi-stakeholder committee on Net Mundial between 2013 and 14. And also, he was a special advisor to the chairman of the UN Internet Governance Forum between 2006 and 2010. His book, An Introduction to Internet Governance, has been translated into 9 languages and is used as a textbook for academic courses worldwide. Our fourth speaker, my dear colleague, is Professor Claude Chaudet. Dr. Claude Chaudet has been a software engineer since 1999. He was an associate professor at Telecom Paris Tech for 10 years between 2005 and 2015, before joining Webster University, Geneva in 2016, where he is head of the Mathematics and Computer Science Department. Professor Chaudet has participated in research projects on the use of digital technologies and has published academic papers in the fields of the Internet of Things, cybersecurity, and also data privacy. Dr. Chaudet obtained his PhD in 2004 in the field of communication networks from the Institut National des Sciences Appliquées in Lyon. And our moderator, our distinguished moderator and our dear colleague is Ambassador Michel Vetet. Ambassador Vetet worked for the ICRC between 1996 and 2007, 1996 and 2000, excuse me, first as a legal officer involved in the diplomatic conference on the reaffirmation and development of international humanitarian law, the CDDH, and later in various capacities as the head of the International Organizations Division at the ICRC, as General Delegate for Europe and North America, and Regional Delegate for Southern Africa, and also as an assistant to the President of the ICRC, Dr. Corneliu Sumaruga. Currently, Professor Ambassador Vetet is Ambassador of the Order of Malta to monitor and combat trafficking in persons, and also Deputy Permanent Observer of the Order of Malta to the United Nations in Geneva. He's also Geneva Representative and Director of the Summer Course of the International Institute of Humanitarian Law, San Remo, and he is also a colleague here at Webster. He's an Associate Professor of Public International Law at Webster University, Geneva. So with no further ado, I will hand things over to my distinguished colleague, Ambassador Vetet. Ambassador, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jovan. And allow me to thank you, Professor Goudarzi, for taking this very timely initiative. Indeed, the pandemic is creating a new way of interactions. But I would like to take here to show the, I have a slide. Is it possible? Okay, thank you. So the pandemic is indeed creating a new way of interactions between individuals and states. The pandemic has profoundly changed multilateral diplomacy to the point of paralysis. How indeed could a Human Rights Council session be held by taking account COVID-19 restrictions? This challenge was taken up with intelligence, elegance, and persistence by its president, Her Excellency Ambassador Elisabeth Tichy-Fisslberger, whom we are lucky enough to see today on this panel. This is a new phenomenon. A pioneer of virtual diplomacy, Professor Jovan Kurbalija, will tell us that for years, with the support of the governments of Switzerland, Sweden, and Malta, he has been advocating for opening virtual embassies and using digital diplomacy. As for the ICRC, how can we forget André Rochat in the 1960s going to carry the message of Geneva on a camel in the desert of Yemen? Today, the internet is part of the dissemination of humanitarian law, of instantaneous and almost universal communication in many languages, of course, including Arabic. And it is also a way to access information within the ICRC. Actually, the use of technology in diplomacy is not new, but each new technology has disrupted and almost made diplomacy disappear, seemingly rendering diplomats, embassies, and even permanent missions useless. Instead, each new technological evolution has given new tools to diplomats, allowing them to better communicate with their capital, to receive instructions and support from their ministries, and also to add speed and precision to their communication with their fellow diplomats from other countries and with the public. Digital diplomacy does not replace a traditional face-to-face diplomacy. Traditional and digital diplomacy coexist, complement rather than compete with each other. And I know Jovan Kurbalija quoted this, but allow me to quote it again. On receiving the first telegraph message in the 1860s, Lord Palmerston, British Foreign Secretary, was noted to have exclaimed, "My God, this is the end of diplomacy." Interestingly, diplomacy has survived the telegraph as well as subsequently technological innovations such as the radio, telephone, television, and faxes. Every new major technological device has prompted reactions similar to that of Lord Palmerston's. World leaders and diplomats use social media, and as we know, Twitter in particular, to speak and engage directly to their audience to seek to influence. But I must say that digital diplomacy, as Professor Joseph Nye said in the 1990s, is an integral part of soft power, the ability to set the agenda in world politics through persuasion, enticing and attracting others through the force of one's beliefs, values and ideas, and not through military and economic coercion. And Nye, in 2005, introduces, quote, smart power as a balance of hard and soft power. And now, I must say, webinars are replacing side events and even conferences. There is a need for new hardware, could be microphones, could be cameras, could be floodlights and software. There is a need also for training, and here possibly Webster could do something, even for ambassadors to use these new technologies to the fullest. Virtual diplomacy reduces the informal contacts so useful in the corridors of the Palais des Nations, and it allows informal contact with known or unknown interlocutors beyond the circle of usual suspects of international Geneva. One can thus get a minister to intervene online without the expense or the protocol formalities. One can invite to the same seminar an African nun, an Austrian lawyer, a former German prostitute, a French official in charge of the fight against criminal networks, without having to negotiate with the security of the Palais des Nations to get them in. And the door will be wide open to the public, live or recorded, without having to take into account the reduced availability of conference rooms. Publicity for this intervention and events will be online, by email, on social networks. Does it mean that traditional diplomacy is disappearing? Yes, some external forms do. The essential, no. And the essential is definitely the human factor. It is the sender who will make the message be read. In this contact, even through Zoom, that will get the message across. And now I'm pleased to give the floor to Ambassador Elisabeth Tichy-Fisslberger. Elisabeth, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Michel, and thank you for having recommended me to take part in this event on a very interesting topic, as you just explained. It's very nice to see some friends, old friends on the screen at least. Good evening to all of you. Now, 2 years ago, I would have thought I was a highly unlikely candidate to talk about virtual diplomacy. As you can see, I'm not part of the generation of digital natives, and I was always a bit making fun of what I called the digital toys of my younger collaborators. But in the last year, we learned quite a lot. I was also planning, like Michel, to quote Lord Palmerston. So that is done already, but it shows that diplomacy has survived many types of technical revolutions, and we're in the midst of one of them. Most people would agree that digital diplomacy really started with what we call the Arab Spring, where we had a young generation who were much better able to handle digital tools than the then authorities, which really started a political and social movement and showed that these new tools were very powerful. And the interesting thing for foreign ministries was to see that the same tools which had helped trigger the rebellion were also used by foreign ministries to repatriate the nationals who had got stranded because of that rebellion. It was my job at the time to do that, by the way. Not much late in 2014, we saw that digital tools were used massively during the Crimea crisis, to put it elegantly, both for information and disinformation purposes. We had a similar phenomenon 2 years later with the American presidential elections, which then showed us a president who was conducting politics by Twitter, including foreign policy. Also, authorities then started to realize the importance of these digital tools, which could reach much beyond traditional media, and which could actually be game changers in the unfolding of geopolitical events. Some foreign ministries started at the time to develop what one might call countervailing tools, algorithms which were able to spot certain things like, for example, disinformation. What the pandemic did to this development was to speed it up, to multiply the use of digital tools with breathtaking speed. People of my generation started video conferencing all day with platforms hitherto known only to nerds. And suddenly we use them all. Questions remain and are still not solved, like on data protection and security, but we use these tools on a daily basis. Thousands of people do so. And another thing which multiplied is WhatsApp groups of all sizes and all kinds, which help prepare other meetings. I was asked to talk primarily about the Human Rights Council last year, which I had the honor to preside, and I'm happy to report that the Human Rights Council was the last body of the United Nations which went into lockdown, and the first one to come out again, and it was the only body, at least in Geneva, which completed its full annual program. So we were quite proud to have been able to do that. I must say it was easy to go into the lockdown and much less easy to come out of it again, because while most people had agreed that going into the lockdown was a measure required for health and security, taking up that work again, resuming, became political, because there are always people who don't like the Human Rights Council and who pretexted health worries, when in reality they hoped they would be able to silence the Human Rights Council, at least for a while. And these people would form what I'd call unholy alliances with other people who really had health fears and preoccupations. There was always a critical mass of countries, however, who thought that this corona crisis was not only a health crisis and an economic crisis, but also a human rights emergency. And it would have been a very poor show by rather privileged diplomats in Geneva to just go into hiding when you have such a crisis at hand. We therefore started rather early in April already to have first fully virtual conversations with the High Commissioner, with some special representatives, special rapporteurs on the human rights implications of the COVID crisis. But of course, there is a limit to what you can do virtually, because all the rules of procedures are made for real meetings, for physical meetings. We wanted to leave a tangible trace of what we were doing in these virtual meetings. And so we started for the first time ever to negotiate a presidential statement on the human rights implications of COVID in a virtual way. And because there were no rules of procedure of how to do that, we needed to achieve consensus, which we did, but it wasn't easy. Much more difficult than to negotiate a regular resolution, because for a regular resolution, you only need a simple majority, and that's much easier to get. After that, we started thinking, how can we resume the regular work of the council? By then it was May, and the figures of infections were quite okay. And of course, there were certain restrictions, but they were being gradually lifted. We knew to reach consensus again. If we wanted to have different meetings from the ones we had had the year before, we needed consensus because you can only change the rules of procedure by consensus. So we started by organizing a number of what we called open, broad conversations, consultations, listen to the worries of absolutely every delegation, the arguments they had against taking up work. And of course, instead of saying we don't like the Human Rights Council, they would usually say this is dangerous because of health reasons. So we had to address every single argument people brought, which I think we managed to do. And the trick was to say, we'll do hybrid meetings. So that meant we had the biggest room available in Geneva, the Assembly Hall, which can normally take up to 2,000 people almost. We used that for the 180-something delegations, each of whom was allowed to bring one delegate only if they wanted. If they didn't want to do this, they could also participate online. So we took away from people the argument that this might be dangerous because all were free to stay home and participate from there. This was possible because we had some very committed technicians, because none of this was prepared anywhere. And I must say it wasn't the experienced UN technicians who did the trick, but it was some very young interns in OHCHR who were just nerds and who just did it and who were just wonderful and saved our day. So we started doing things again. The only group which was still complaining were the interpreters, because they actually very much enjoyed the total lockdown with the full salary. But they didn't have the argument either that this was dangerous, because we put each of them in a booth by themselves. So they had the full sound quality that you have in a professional interpreter's booth. And they still had complete security because they were alone there. During the year 2020, the Human Rights Council, all in all, adopted about 100 resolutions, which is an average figure. And in addition to that, we had a number of panels and intersessional events and 2 UPR sessions. Normally, there are 3 UPR sessions in a year. This year, we had only 2. The second of which was in November. And there the Swiss told us we could only have 5 people in a room. So we had to reorchestrate everything within less than 24 hours, have the UPR session completely virtually, but that did work out rather well. So this is how we did it. I think that because we started so early, earlier than many other organizations, including in New York, many of them were looking at us at how we had done it. And we, in a way, we developed a few ideas, which was successful in other places as well. So we did it, but of course it wasn't the same thing as in-person meetings. But not everything was only a second best solution. All these virtual tools have pros and cons. And I was wondering whether virtual diplomacy is actually the ideal expression, because it's not the diplomacy which is virtual, it's real diplomacy, but it's carried out by virtual tools. Virtual diplomacy sounds almost like fake diplomacy, which it isn't. So some of these digital tools made our lives easier. For example, as already mentioned by Michelle, we saw some very high-ranking people speaking at meetings where they would almost certainly not have attended if a physical presence had been required. Some people also point out that video conferences are actually quite pleasant because they're less pompous, and speakers tend to be less loquacious than if they have to travel very far to give a speech. Some delegations benefited in particular, especially those who are very far away in small countries who sometimes lack resources. For example, a nearby country attending a UPR session would come with delegates from various ministries who would just travel in normal times. If you came from somewhere in the Pacific, you would probably only be afforded to send 1 person who would then have to speak for a variety of ministries, which is very difficult. So in a way, for something like the UPR session, it was probably more democratic because all the countries were in the same boat. But I have to say that many delegations insisted very much that it's nice to have the UPR virtually without traveling delegations, but that's not what we want to do 100% in future. We still want delegations to come and to have that personal interchange for the UPR. Some features of the virtual tools are, of course, suboptimal. And that has to do, for example, with civil society, which has a strong role in the Human Rights Council than in almost any other bodies. We did find a way of including NGO speakers, albeit not all who would have wanted, in sessions of the Human Rights Council, but that kind of fertile ecosystem around the Human Rights Council, which allows NGOs to exchange and to not only opinions, but also information, that of course could not be replaced by virtual tools. On the other hand, of course, virtual sessions allow you to include people whom you might not have reached otherwise. This did cause some tricky questions, one must say. When we started virtual meetings, NGOs from all over the world wanted to participate, understandably. On the other hand, the meeting time given to the Human Rights Council is already too short all the time, and we have to limit speaking time for people, and we haven't really solved that question. This year, the present president of the Human Rights Council found a solution in that she said, for this year, we'll just admit NGOs, not only if they're accredited in Geneva, but all over the world, but we only admit the average number of NGOs who spoke on a particular subject matter last year or in the last few years. So they work with an average number, because otherwise you have an explosion from just the NGOs in Geneva to the ones all over the world. A normal session of the Human Rights Council comes with about 200 side events. Last year we had to cancel them all, and the Secretariat said, understandably, they were not in a position to monitor an unknown number of online events that people might have wanted to make, because that would have required taking a certain responsibility that such events were suitable for being part of the Human Rights Council. And we didn't have people to monitor that kind of thing all over the world. So we had no side events at all, which was a pity. Country visits by special rapporteurs and other mandate holders, of course, could not take place, which meant that the Council didn't get some of the reports it should normally have got. Routine visits were not possible either. Myself, for example, I thought at the beginning of the year that I would travel to New York 3 times a year, like my predecessors had done. Everything was done virtually. Encounter with the third committee, with the General Assembly, and with the Security Council, and with a number of high-level UN officials in New York. All of that was done on screen, and of course it wasn't the same thing. But the biggest deficit, I think, is the human interaction, which you cannot replace by a screen. Even a live intervention in a meeting is not the same thing as a genuine dialogue, let alone a pre-recorded statement. And these days we get more and more pre-recorded statements, which mean that people don't really listen to what others have to say. Somebody said virtual diplomacy does not allow to build trust, but trust is the currency of diplomacy. And that, I think, is very true. If you see people on a screen only, you cannot pick up the signals that you would otherwise pick up, like how this person reacts to something that is being said, either unpleasant or maybe even funny. You cannot read the room. You don't sense the general mood. You don't know whether people are nervous or bored or angry. You cannot observe who talks to whom in the margins. Plus, it is easier for people to camp on their red lines from a distance than when they're in the room confronted with all these other peoples who don't like these red lines. Finding a difficult compromise is always about a give and take. And that requires confidence and is often achieved by unspoken messages and gestures, which you cannot use either in a virtual setting. You cannot give sensitive messages with the necessary nuance. You cannot be sure about confidentiality. And in the most difficult negotiations, you need exactly that. For example, if it's about mediating a conflict or something, you cannot be sure whether you don't have unwanted participants. We certainly did have cases last year in the Bureau of the Human Rights Council that some people tried to crash into our meeting. So these things are done, and maybe those who tried to crash into our meetings were not the most skillful ones. Maybe some people listened and we didn't even notice. Personally, I always felt that virtual meetings were fine for exchanging information and routine messages, in particular with people whom you already knew from before. Much more difficult with people whom you don't know yet. But when it really got difficult, you needed personal contacts. So when I was conducting this negotiation with some difficult delegations on whether and how we could take up the work of the Human Rights Council again, none of that was done in virtual meetings. It was all done in bilateral contacts, and it would have been completely impossible otherwise, not least because, as we all know as good diplomats, we use different arguments with different interlocutors as well. You need to do that in multilateral diplomacy. So as I said, we adopted these resolutions, that there was a certain output, but what will remain for the future? One would have to be a prophet to be able to say so, but in my view, my guess is there will be a smart mix of the old tools and the new tools. Some of them will be preserved. We'll certainly stick with some video conferencing because it helps to save time and resources and is very convenient to replace, in particular, meetings with huge numbers of people on relatively routine matters. Maybe the General Assembly of the United Nations will never be the same in the future. That we don't know, we'll see. I think we'll also go using on informal formats of different sizes to prepare for other meetings. We will use digital tools to, even more than in the past, to train diplomats and consular agents, and maybe to compare notes between foreign postings and headquarters before instructions are finalized. Travel will be replaced in part. It's on the one hand, virtual tools are very convenient if they help you go to places which would otherwise be either too far away or dangerous. And some of the special rapporteurs of the UN have actually been saying that this allows for good storytelling. But on the other hand, it's like anything sensitive. The special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council often have to engage in very sensitive interviews and research, and that's best done by personal contact. So we'll have a smart mix. I think what exactly it will look like, maybe we'll discuss that later. I just wanted to finish, read you an advice which I understand President Kennedy used to follow, and that was keep cool, have unlimited patience, never corner an opponent, always assist him to save his face, put yourself in his shoes, avoid self-righteousness like the devil. Now, the features usually used to describe virtual tools are speed, anonymity, and monopoly. And none of these are useful for following President Kennedy's recipe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth and Ticci, for sharing your experience of being the chair of the Human Rights Council, and actually highlighting decisions adopted by consensus. And then consensus, again, is a very, very important way of adopting decisions when you have no objection, or at least no and then also mentioning hybrid meetings. So meaning by that, definitely virtual diplomacy is not excluding also parallelly hybrid meetings. You did a pioneering work within the UN system, and as you said, virtual diplomacy is not fake diplomacy. So thank you again for being with us, and I'm sure there will be questions, and we would be very happy to have your wisdom and your experience to answer those questions. And now I want to give the floor to Nicholas Hawton from the ICRC. Nick, where are you?
I'm in Geneva, so not so far away at the moment.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you very much to Webster University for organising this important event, I think. And I promise not to quote Lord Palmerston nor President Kennedy, so there won't be many quotes. This discussion comes at a very relevant time, as much of the world is still being ravaged by the COVID pandemic, and increasing amounts of diplomacy and other human activities are switching to what we call the virtual world. And I think, Ambassador Verte, your line that digital and in-person diplomacy complement each other is very relevant and important. They're not competing. I think the question is how to calibrate them correctly for maximum effectiveness. And as I think you also said, it also boils down to the human at the end of the day. And Ambassador Tichy-Fisslberger, who said virtual or digital diplomacy can be used for information or indeed disinformation. And we know the problems that there are relating to disinformation, perhaps in today's world. I just wanted a quick word about my own background. I actually spent most of my career working as a BBC journalist, mainly in the Balkans. I also worked for the European Union in 2 of their crisis missions, including in Libya. And then I saw the light and joined the ICRC, and I'm currently diplomatic advisor there. And I must point out at this stage that the views that I expressed this evening are my own personal views and not the official views of the ICRC. The reason I mention my background is to show that I'm coming at this issue from a part diplomatic, part communication angle. I think most of us would agree that diplomacy and communication are very much intertwined, and perhaps the world of virtual diplomacy encapsulates both aspects very well. My interest in virtual diplomacy led myself and my colleague, Dr. Sharuk Shakirian, to write an ICRC blog piece about the growth of virtual diplomacy and the techniques and so on, the lessons learned from it, and some of the ideas that I'm going to express come from that blog. My presentation really tries to focus on the heart of the matter, which our last contributor quite rightly referred to, how to achieve that all-important ingredient of trust when it comes to virtual diplomacy. Mm-hmm. A quick story. Back in Libya in 2013, I was with the EU border mission in an increasingly unpredictable post-Civil War environment. There's a patchwork of armed groups, agendas, foreign support, random killings, and we in the EU were all holed up in the Corinthia Hotel in Tripoli. In fact, it was so ropey that the Prime Minister was kidnapped from that hotel one night while we were all sleeping. So things were really looking bad at that time. Our job was to try and help the official government rebuild its borders following the revolution. Suffice it to say, it was becoming so dangerous that actually traveling to the borders themselves was becoming extremely risky. And we tried to communicate with tribes and armed groups through phone calls and emails and messages, and to little avail. And progress really came when you actually met somewhere in the desert or in a hotel private meeting room, and you could see people eye to eye, face to face. That's where the connection was. That's where progress could be made and trust could be built. The question is it possible to replicate that person-to-person chemistry in the virtual world? Before I get into perhaps answering that, I'd like to take a slight diversion and just clarify perhaps 2 issues. Virtual diplomacy is nothing new. I think we know that. For years pre-COVID, discussions and negotiations took place often in a virtual way, but it's the speed of change that's quite remarkable that the ambassador referred to. Virtual diplomacy, one way or another, is really increasing. The rate of change is enormous. The pandemic is the driver behind this. Secondly, there's this question of perhaps it will just go away when the COVID pandemic disappears. In my view, it probably won't. People are likely to work more from home. Organizations and businesses can see the advantages. Savings can be made, and the technology is developing all the time, as we're aware. So it's probably wise to think that we've crossed some sort of Rubicon, and there will be no going back to exactly how it was. So we better get with the program, as it were. Okay, so back to the main thread of what I'd like to talk about. 3 points. The first is, how is our diplomatic environment being impacted? What are the challenges we face? The second is, what do we mean when we talk about trust in diplomatic terms? And thirdly, what can we do to try to enhance trust in this virtual space, this virtual sphere? So firstly, how is our diplomatic environment being affected? And I suppose my greater experience in diplomacy comes from humanitarian diplomacy, but I think probably a lot of it applies in the broader sphere as well. There's a number of points we can make here. The first is what we could call empathy deficit. As we all know, communicating with a screen is different from communicating with real life human beings. reactions, gestures, tone, smell, and even silence leave impressions and tell their own stories. The chemistry, the body language, the eye contact, and the spontaneity don't fully translate into the virtual world. In simple bilateral meetings, especially if we know the interlocutor, if we had coffees and lunches and dinners and meetings before the virtual took over, then it's possible to have that trust already. Even in large multilateral meetings where the task is to read out a scripted statement, for instance, the ICRC president, when he's addressing the UN Security Council, he will read a statement that is there. There is going to be no challenge, no changes to that. This is a relatively simple engagement. The dangers are limited. But in the process of conflict resolution or more complex multilateral negotiations, challenges emerge. There's far more difficulty in creating those connections that we talked about, establishing relationships and feeling that empathy. And therefore, this makes it all the more difficult to achieve one's diplomatic goals. The second point related to this is what we can call space change. Again, this has been alluded to. The typical way for diplomacy to take place, and with good reason, is in person, and for the reasons we've talked about. But the rules and practicalities are changing. Now we're often communicating directly from a home environment or a personal office. Some of us fake our backgrounds. I have to put my hand up and say, no, this is a real background behind. And we can't, when we're at home or in certain environments, there's crying babies, boiling kettles, drills of workmen. We all know the problems and the challenges. With space becoming more subjective and more individualized, I think two issues are arising. First, the coffee corridor connection is lost. Mm-hmm. The discussions and connections made in those informal spaces around traditional diplomatic locations simply can't be replicated. We know that. Secondly, the protocol systems of precedence and physical engagement can lead to a narrowing of the diplomatic space. And this is important, I think. With fewer people in the room, the power dynamics can shift. And this can have implications for how organizations are able to influence decisions for the benefit of those most in need. When I'm talking about humanitarian diplomacy, decisions can be made with, just a quick video conference, 2 or 3 key principles, and that is it. The idea of why would we need to lobby? Why would we need multiple conversations? Why would we need to meet people if it can be done in that space? So there is a danger that diplomatic space can be narrowed. And then thirdly, in this section, security deficit, I don't think I need to go into any detail. It's obvious who actually controls the back doors, if there are back doors to these platforms, what are the legal safeguards. The speed with which new platforms are being developed poses another challenge. Are negotiators happy in negotiating on virtual platforms, which, well, we don't really know who is accessing them and how and when? These are difficult questions. And I know from my own recent experience that states can be very reluctant to discuss sensitive issues quite naturally when they don't really know who is listening, when they're listening, and the implications and consequences of that. So that's the first issue that I just wanted to look at, the impact on diplomacy. The second point is, what do we mean when we talk about trust in diplomatic terms? Now, we can all probably have our own definition of trust. Let's work on the basis of the Oxford English Dictionary, no finer source. Trust, and to quote it, trust is to believe that somebody is good, honest, sincere, and they'll do what you expect of them or do the right thing. One might say this is one of the cornerstones of diplomacy. If you have trust, it facilitates so much in diplomatic terms, enables information to be shared, deals to be made, relations to be built, negotiations to be successful, and it reduces the need for complex monitoring or complicated compliance systems, crucial when we're talking about high risk, for instance, in Libya, as I referred to earlier. When trust exists, you can achieve such amazing things. In October last year, the ICRC was involved in this amazing prisoner exchange in Yemen during the Yemen conflict. More than 1,000 prisoners on both sides of the conflict were returned home, and it was, I can tell you, it was an incredible operation, simultaneously involving multiple aircraft, countless staff, and the goodwill of so many people. And that was really a great humanitarian act, and many other organizations and states are engaged in it. But it can really have these achievements. Show the trust on one side, and it builds trust on the other, like a circle of action reaction. I trust you, therefore you trust me, and you build it up over time. The third issue that I wanted to refer to is what can we try to do if we accept that trust is important, if we can work on a rough definition of what it is, and if we are aware of the challenges, what can we do practically to try and enhance trust in this bizarre sphere that we're all trying to grapple with. Perhaps the younger generations are far faster at this, but we can all still try. And I think when we have the discussion and questions, it would be great to listen to people and techniques and ideas, and we learn together in this. But perhaps a few just initial thoughts. Technology, any channel of technology must be understood before being utilized, before we use it. We've all seen in the media what happens if you don't push the right button, the camera keeps running, all the rest of it, very embarrassing moments. So know the beast that you're trying to ride would be the rule, the motto there. Secondly, emotional intelligence transferred. The simple art of listening and observing becomes ever more important in the virtual diplomatic space. The change in tone, the language used, the length of the pause, the passing facial expression, the body movement, the clothes worn, the background chosen. When you're engaged in this, don't miss a trick. Active listening is so important. I can tell you, I spent 15 years as a BBC journalist. The one thing I learned from journalism, from interviewing war criminals in Bosnia or the victims of war criminals in Bosnia, you pick up the nuances, the emotions, the attitudes by listening. Just listen, by watching. So you need to, in this virtual world, to be switched on. Don't miss the signs, attention to detail. You need to see those details within the screen. In a sense, it's easier when it's three-dimensional and we're in a room. You almost instinctively pick up tones and pause and so on. But maybe in the virtual world, you just need to listen more carefully, attention to more detail. A third point, which again has been alluded to, build the trust elsewhere if you can. Build the relationships before whatever event it is, whatever negotiations are taking place. So everyone knows who you are. Everyone knows what to expect when the virtual talks or negotiations take place. For instance, policy dialogues. I'm engaged in trying to arrange and involved in policy dialogues with some Gulf states, between the ICRC and some Gulf states. We don't just go into the policy dialogue and start talking. There's a lot of preparation beforehand, a lot of in-person talks when possible. If not, then we do it virtually. You build up a relationship like that before the key issues are talked about or negotiated or agreed upon. And keep the relationship going afterwards. Obviously, we're talking about human relationships. As Ambassador Verte said at the start, it all boils down to the human at the end of the day, either person to person or via this screen that we're all communicating through. Get the feedback afterwards. How was it for you? What worked? What didn't? And linked to this, again, no need to go into detail, clarity of purpose, always be clear of that. There's one final point that I wanted to make related to this, and that's the idea of community and trust. In an existing community, we already have a level of trust. For instance, within the ICRC, we have ways of operating, rules of engagement, as it were. We know how things work. This creates a level of connection already, a level of understanding, and therefore trust. Even here in this meeting, everyone has an awareness of Webster University, probably has an interest in diplomacy. We know the rules, we know the rough length of the speeches. There's going to be a question and answer session. We have a protocol, we have introductions. So in a sense, we already have just a sense of belonging by being here. And therefore we have a little bit of trust. Some of us are meeting each other for the first time, but it's the idea of community. With community comes trust. This can apply in a multilateral environment, but might be more tricky in a bilateral environment. first time meetings when you don't know someone, it's walking in the dark a little. I'm conscious that we're short of time, so very quickly, there's a couple of questions that I wanted to throw out there that may or may not be grappled upon.
No, go ahead, Nick. Go ahead.
Okay. I think they're relevant. The question of a lot of this boils down to security, negotiations and trust and so on. How secure can our platforms be? Whilst nothing is 100%, even if it's in a physical environment, you never know if somebody's got a glass on the wall in the next room and all the rest of it. But what is the limits of the technology in terms of security? And secondly, linked to this, what are the chances of maybe a Swiss sovereign cloud space being created where this diplomacy can happen? Just as many sort of sensitive talks, peace talks, negotiations take place in physical Switzerland for all the obvious neutrality and other reasons, could we create a space in the ether, a virtual Switzerland in the sky? Is it technically possible? I mean, the rewards for that in terms of creating trust would be enormous. I think that's something worth addressing. So I'll finish now. The discussion is entitled Virtual Diplomacy, Evolution or Revolution. I think perhaps we're all very much caught up in this whirlwind of change and adaptation. But personally, I think we're on a path that's got its roots some time ago. So my answer is evolution rather than revolution. Thank you very much. Thanks for that.
Oh, thank you very much, Nick. Very, very interesting indeed. You put together your diplomatic and communication experiences, and obviously what you said about trust is very important. Definitely very much part of ICRC's approach to states and non-state actors, and definitely also the question of security deficit. But security deficit also exists on the phone. Security deficit also exists in conference rooms, in hotel rooms, and so on. And actually, we should be acting. We should act as if every word would be recorded, reported. And we are not ashamed if it appears in a report or in a newspaper. And then also, of course, you're right in saying active listening. Yes, it happens. It happens. It should happen. And I say people should pay attention to what they see on the screen. And as you say, it could be the way of dressing, the way of gesturing, and so on. And then I love also your virtual neutral Switzerland space, so to speak. I don't know, possibly Jovan Kurbalija could tell us something about this, because I'm sure that's a reflection he could contribute to. But no, I'm very happy to hear you and to see that the ICRC has indeed a very good diplomatic advisor in the age of virtual diplomacy. Thank you very much, Nick. And now, my old friend, Jovan Kurbalija, Professor Kurbalija, I'm sure you will tell us also many interesting things, and also possibly you could answer a few questions like Nick, or possibly questions which were evoked during Ambassador Tichy's intervention. Jovan, thank you very much for being with us, because indeed you are a gem in Geneva. You are a pioneer in digital diplomacy, and I'm sure you have a lot to tell us. Up to you.
Thank you, Michel. It's great to be today here at your session, and you can enjoy my fake background, but I'm for real in Geneva. Now, let me just comment on a few points from the previous discussion. What Nick just said is basically something which could be considered as a common sense, but it's not so common. Like we meet at the UN behind me or in New York, at the places beyond national jurisdiction, we don't meet in that way online. We meet at Zoom, at WebEx, at other platforms in private spaces. Just imagine as a metaphor, as if we have a Security Council of General Assembly in the hotel. That won't make sense. Definitely Swiss infrastructure would be useful and important, but that space and place should be beyond any national jurisdiction. Like we have a Palais here in Geneva or other spaces or UN in Vienna or in New York. That's, I think, important also on symbolic level because the buildings communicate also symbolism. And that's one important issue, which we have been discussing among also with colleagues from ICRC and other organizations. Now, let me just comment quickly on our good old friends, Palmerston, and I will add John Kerry as one probably of the most impressive diplomats of younger generation. You heard what Palmerston said. He indicated change. While Kerry had a different, when they asked him about virtual diplomacy, he said, this is just diplomacy, full stop. And in that dynamism between change and continuity, Palmerston's impression with technology and thinking that everything is changing and continuity, we can trace history of diplomacy since our far predecessors jumped from the tree in Serengeti and realized that it was better to hear the messenger than to eat him or her. We even find recently that in primates, in chimpanzees, with Frank de Waal, famous primatologist, there are elements of empathy, fairness, and even compromise. I will share a few links to that fascinating podcast, but I won't go that way. Now, in that continuity and change, and history is always useful, we can come to, let's say, Vienna Congress. We have ambassador of Austria, and it's very often forgotten that it was one of the most successful congresses in the history. And one of the reasons was that the Kaiser at that time invested heavily into social life, into entertainment, banquets, and other peripherals of diplomacy. What was agreed in 1815 was one of the most durable peace agreement. There were wars, 1848, and the century was very, let's say, fluctuating and tough. But we had more or less 100 years of the peace. And then another peace talks. I'm sorry, it's not COVID, it's just allergy. Another peace talks in Versailles. Scientists, statistician, they wanted to make scientific peace, well-calculated peace about reparation and everything else. And we know from the history what's happened. We had a peace for what, 20, 25 years, and very terrible last century. This is one message which we should keep in mind when we discuss digital, virtual, or what John Kerry said in his words, just diplomacy. That way of communicating over distance or negotiating over the distance is not new at all. It was, here you can see what was happening in Vienna, but we had one more recent development, which was negotiation. I'm just trying to find the image, but in the 1963, when Hughton connected from New York to ITU through the remote facilitation, remote link. This technology has existed, especially over the last 20 years with the internet, and it was available. But circumstances, pandemic circumstances, moved it from the technological possibility into reality. That social innovation or human innovation is always much more complex and much more demanding. And it happened out of necessity. And as Ambassador indicated, it was fascinating how diplomacy adjusted in very agile and fast way. Diplomacy is often considered as traditional, slow, and very formal profession. But what has happened over the last 12 months has proven completely different dynamics. There was a need for diplomacy, and that need was filled with real agility. Therefore, this is a history of diplomacy, history of permanent need, and this is continuity in diplomacy, to engage, to reach the compromise, to solve the conflicts in the peaceful way. Continuity of the core function of diplomacy and the change in the way how diplomacy is performed, whether it is online, in situ, hybrid, proximity. Let me just comment, and with that I will close, on three important aspects. First one is that we forget importance of protocol and routines. We often dismiss protocol as unnecessary add-on that you can, especially with technology, which you can scrap. But protocol and routines, especially let's say in certain parts of the world, have a deeper anthropological and cultural aspect. Therefore, that is a huge challenge ahead of us. How to recreate some elements of hierarchy, signaling, representation. We shouldn't avoid that when president speaks and prime minister, they represent countries. They represent maybe 1 million people with small states, on 10 million, 1 billion. That requires some sort of arrangement. Therefore, that protocol and routine challenge is, at least in my view, one of the major challenges, not because of unnecessary inventing complexity or something which is needed, but because of the functionality and importance of the protocol, etiquette, and routine. Second point, and we are working a lot in Diplo, we are creating toolkit to help people to decide when they should meet in person. Hopefully we'll get back to normality, when they should meet online, and when they should meet in the hybrid setting. Now, obviously, we heard a lot that human communication is so essential, trust building, chemistry, empathy, body language. But we shouldn't also underestimate that there were examples from the history where exactly that elements of communication, direct communication, was filtered. Vietnam peace negotiation, 1975, Dayton peace negotiation, delegation of Serbia, Croatia, and Bosnia, they were not in direct contact. There were proximity talks. Diplomats were going between different delegations. Therefore, maybe in that toolkit for some minor situation, we may clean the emotions and use advantage of technology to have this proximity talks. And the last point, and with this I will conclude, is the need to adjust buildings, procedures to this new, most likely hybrid reality. We'll need new sharing skills, we'll need reporting skills, what Nick said, a new way of body language, reading the message, reading the signals, engagement. That requires a training. And here I'm a bit worried because there is an interruption with the next generation of diplomats when it comes to that thick heritage of the human communication. And that has to be somehow nudged, facilitated, recreated by places like Webster University and other universities, because that creates, let's say, depth of the diplomatic interaction, which then can be organized in situ, online, in other ways. But that is badly needed, and we have really to step back and to think about space where we can negotiate, what Nick mentioned, new type of training, optimal way of negotiating, and get back to this interplay between continuity and change. Continuity, what John Kerry said, continuity of core function of diplomacy to solve conflict in peaceful ways through compromise and engagement, and change, which what impressed Lord Palmerston, that new tools are here to be used. And this is very, very possible to make that fine interplay between these two aspects, continuity and change. Over to you, Michel.
Oh, thank you very much, Jovan. Excellent expose, but I'm sure we can ask you a few more questions after we are listening to Claude Chaudet. But when you say continuity, that's very good. And when you mention proximity talks, I like this because it shows that actually face-to-face is not always a solution. It's not. It never has been. I would say, and at times people prefer not to see each other, unfortunately. And then also your stress on the need for training. Obviously, yes, I think we all need to improve and to improve actually very regularly, because as you know, we have new software, new hardware, and also I would not say new protocol, but still people are getting used to ways and means, and for example, are getting used to, for example, the quality, the quality of your camera, the quality of your mic, the quality of your PowerPoint slides. And if you're not up to this, then you're out of step, so to speak. So I don't know. But would you like to say something before I give the floor to Claude or Jovan?
No. You're asking me, or?
Yeah, no. But then I'll give the floor to Claude, and I'm sure we will come back to you in the question and answer period.
Sure.
Okay, good. So, Claude Chaudet, you're a professor at Webster, and we are very happy to have you because you are actually the master of technical tricks, so to speak. We have a lot to learn from you, and that's why I'm looking forward to listening to your intervention. Claude, up to you. You have the floor.
Thank you for the introduction. So great responsibility then. So I'm going to share my screen because, yeah, I'll try to do that.
Good.
Yeah, okay. So play that. Do you still see my slides?
Fine.
Okay, good. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm the head of the computer science department. So therefore, well, I'm more on the technical side. I know very few about diplomacy and the current diplomacy and what happens in the virtual diplomacy. So in the short presentation, what I wanted to do is to give you, to give a focus on a few technical aspects that may be relevant for diplomacy. Of course, that will not cover the whole spectrum, but it can be a good starting point for further discussions. So first, everybody would agree probably that the speed at which information and communication technology has progressed over the past years is really tremendous. I mean, things tend to be a bit better, easier, less formal, and more effective today somehow because technology has invaded step by step, if you want, every aspect of people's life. Think about the way that we communicate today, of course, but also that we take pictures, we listen to music. Everything has become digital and goes through a computer, a smartphone, or something like that. So when we look at ICT, sorry, we often hear the same terms. Okay, on the information side, so the acquisition, storage, processing of data, artificial intelligence is on every mouth because now we have enough computation power, storage, space, etc., to manipulate massive volumes of data. So data centers are part of our lives today. On the communication side, it's the network part. It keeps getting faster and more reliable and more present everywhere and everywhen. I mean, when you think about the speed that we reach today, we have optical fiber going through lots of homes today, even to the home, and cellular networks, so mobile networks, 4G, 5G, keep improving and promising us new advances and everything. And in the middle, you have some names that you probably hear a lot also about, like Internet of Things or cybersecurity, which in fact encompass a vast variety of technical aspects. Okay, not all of this is relevant for the context that we're looking at tonight, but at least that gives you an idea of the ecosystem. So if we look at the political and diplomatic context, what has been the influence of these technologies? First, everybody mentioned that communication today has changed. It's easy, it's instantaneous, and it's always available, which means that from the political side, there's some kind of expectation of an immediate reaction to anything that happens. The Twitter requirement, if you want. So people are expected to comment, to have an opinion on everything, and a very fast one without getting the time to get the information. Okay, which means also that some leaders can make impulsive statements without the protocol and the language and everything, which can be a challenge for diplomats behind the scene after that. I mean, sometimes it can create some ambiguous situations, voluntarily or not. The other thing that everybody mentioned is that we don't need to travel to meet. So of course, the interaction is sometimes less natural. We have fewer empathy or empathic signs, body language and everything. And sometimes the discussion is also a bit harder. I don't know how much you've interacted on Zoom, but every time you try to, or other systems like that, but every time you try to interrupt somebody, you have a comment to make, it creates that kind of small, small glitch in the conversation where you start saying something, the presenter hears you a bit later, just a little time that's necessary for your voice to reach the ear, and so it stops, and then you start again and just stop. So it's less natural, less spontaneous, I would say, and that probably has some effect on some kind of discussions. I mean, when you're supposed to present something, that's fine. When it's a one-on-one discussion with polite people, it's okay. But in a bigger group, I can see why some people would feel excluded a little bit because they have poor network access or something like that. Okay, and also something that's interesting in this communication or in this on this aspect. I mean, you don't need to travel to meet, but you also don't necessarily need to travel to get the temperature of a situation. I mean, when you send some observers on the field to see, to get a feeling of what's happening, it's important, but it can be supplemented, not replaced, of course, but at least supplemented with everything that happens, Instagram, Facebook Live feeds and everything. And that's probably a tool that can help also to understand a bit better or a bit faster what's going on in this and that area of the world. And also, we used to have, and we still do it, by the way, to have some dedicated specific networks, GovSatcom in Europe, DTS in the US, MidNet in Canada, etc., etc. And the internet may provide a way to replace these, or not to replace them fully, because security is a big aspect, but at least to complement them or to provide some kind of temporary solution when they're not available. So that's one thing. And the other, so that's for the communication part. For the information part, which is a bit borderline to pure diplomacy, but still, today we have a mass of information, and really all the knowledge in the world is accessible on demand. You need an expert on something, you can just browse the university's directory or the company's directory or the relevant directory, write an email, and you don't have to know somebody who knows somebody who has access to that kind of knowledge. So that's something interesting. And the good thing or the bad thing, it depends on the situation, is that the internet never forgets. So as soon as you publish something, it will stay there because it will be saved and replicated and everywhere, and it's hard to fall into oblivion. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about artificial intelligence, because the topic has not been addressed yet, or not particularly at least. So, but it's in everybody's mind. So the thing is that there's a lot of, it's sold as the technology that will replace humans. Okay, it's which is a bit oversold considering today's perspective. So it's not the omnipotent digital beast that we can sometimes imagine, but it's very good at some things. It's very good at extracting sense out of a mass of data, which means that if you got lots of apparently uncorrelated or noisy data, you can run some algorithms and it will make sense out of it. Okay, it's also good at producing some contents by mimicking something learned. Okay, so you probably have seen all the deep learning based art production, where you can submit a picture and it will transform it to you in the style of a Van Gogh, in the style of a Japanese anime or whatever. Okay, and it could be also useful to write down some text. I mean, write down some text in the style of the diplomatic style, or to edit speeches or something like that. Okay, the thing is that it's generally costly. It's costly because to produce something meaningful, you have to feed the beast with a lot of data. Okay, it's costly also in terms of energy. It consumes a lot, all these data centers, and in terms of hardware, you need a mass of computers to run all of that. Okay, and it's vulnerable to some attacks. Typical one is adversarial attack on machine learning, for example. So I'll just briefly show you an example like that comes from a research paper, where a typical usage of artificial intelligence is classification. So I submit a picture like that of a panda, and the system will tell me that it's a panda and it has a 57.7% confidence. So it trusts that the picture is a panda with that. So if you just add a little bit of noise, so that's the type of noise that you can add, very subtle, very tiny, okay, then the system will believe that it's a gibbon with 99.3 confidence. Okay, of course, this is for image classification, but if you apply the same logic to something more important or something like that, it means that the system can be wrong. Okay, and if somebody wants to fool the system, and if they're good enough, they could trick the system into making false decisions. So that's the message behind that. Okay, so it will not replace diplomacy, of course, but still it can assist humans if used properly. Detecting the premises of a crisis, analyzing the whole feed of social networks, trying to make sense out of that and see when something like the Arab Springs could rise, something like that. Also forensics analysis. Let's say that negotiation went wrong. You can analyze it a posteriori to try to see where, well, when things change, or what was the match that led the fire, or something like that. Okay, and of course, training is crucial. Okay, like I said. Okay. Oh yeah, and another important thing also is that one of the I put that into the artificial intelligence section, but that's not only relevant for artificial intelligence, is that with all these technologies, you have somehow a certain loss of accountability. I mean, let's say that you use an AI-based system to take decisions, okay, and the decision turns out to be wrong. You can always say, you can always blame the machine. The machine gave me wrong information, and nobody's going to look because the algorithm is a black box. So nobody will be able to go and have a look. That's true for artificial intelligence, that's obvious. It's also true for virtual communication. Let's say that you have somebody quits the negotiation table at a critical moment. Okay, they can always blame the internet connection, just like our students sometimes do. I've got a pure internet connection, sorry for the exam and everything. So that, I mean, that's something that also needs to be taken into account, is that you use, in fact, a very large system, the internet or data center or something like that, that you don't have control on it from end to end. So something can go wrong in the middle, really go wrong, or pretend to go wrong. Okay, so now the core of the problem comes with cybersecurity, of course. So cybersecurity is something that's very, very large. I mean, it encompasses everything that can go wrong, from failures to malicious attacks. Okay, and when it comes to our tonight's topic, of course, as soon as you communicate over the internet, you're subject to all the state-of-the-art cyber threats. So ransomware, for example, encrypting data to take it hostage. You're connected, so somebody may install a malware on your computer, and then you end up with your hard drive encrypted, and you have a ransom to pay, or no ransom, by the way. It can just be something to lock you out of your data. Okay, that's something. Impersonation also. How do you make sure that the person you're talking to is the person you're talking to? Faking identities of humans, okay, can happen, especially if you don't have the video. And even if you have the video, well, that's still possible. Requires more computation, but it's still possible. Okay, but impersonation of machines. let's say that you want to submit a report on the UN server through the web. If properly, well, if you're under not so easy to do attack, I would say. I mean, the probability is very unlikely, but still, I mean, it depends on the interest that the attacker has. Okay, they could make you upload your report on another server, for example. And for that, they could use a lot of network-based attacks like traffic rerouting, okay, or DNS poisoning. It means that when you communicate with somebody or with a server, you're going to send some messages through the internet, just like you would send a series of letters, okay? So as soon as you send the message in the internet, you're not in control of where the message goes anymore, okay? You trust the networks in the middle, and I say networks plural because you have your own telecom operator network, which will be connected to another operator and to another operator. And there's a chain of operators like that until you reach the destination. So if in the middle, somebody has the power to divert your traffic, or if you believe that you're sending something to one destination, but in fact it's another destination, then your traffic might end somewhere else, or might be duplicated to somewhere else. Okay. Of course, most of the traffic is encrypted. So it means that the person who receives that will probably not be able to decode it, or not immediately, or not in a time frame that has an impact. But still, that's a risk. Okay, somebody in the middle could listen to. Eavesdropping, man in the middle, means that somebody in one of those intermediary networks could intercept the traffic and just listen to what happens. And even without decoding the real content of the message, sometimes just knowing that a message is sent from here to there can be an information that can be useful. It may indicate the start of a negotiation or something like that. Okay, and something that's a bit more likely and would be the type of attack that's called denial of service. Okay, so here you're trying to attack a service to make it unavailable. And if you choose properly the moment, you may exclude somebody from a negotiation table, or make them late, or have an impact on their connection. And it's actually quite easy to do, usually today, in the sense that that's the main reason why your computer could be infected by a malware. Okay, so it's not like in the old days where hackers used to play games, to destructive games. Today, they will just install something on computers to be able to take control when they want and launch a distributed attack, meaning that a billion of computers will send some traffic at the same time to the same server and taking it down. So that's a way to have, if you want, an army of little soldiers who will send just small messages and overload the server. So that can be also something that needs to be taken into account. All of that to say that in the end, it's all a question of trust, a question of trust in the system. Okay, can you trust the system? Can you make sure that it's reliable enough? Okay, so that's for the state-of-the-art cyber threats. But maybe the most important aspect is about social engineering, because today technology is okay. I mean, with encryption, with the computation power that we have, with all the solutions, with the possible agreements with the telecommunication operators, we can make the communication relatively secure. Not 100%, but at least as secure as a physical communication. And the weakest link now is not necessarily the technology, it's the human who uses the technology. One of my friends, when I was in Paris, told me that if you really want to have secrets from the big industries in Saclay, what you need to do is not attack their network. You just go at 6:30 to the bus that takes the people from the campus of Thales and all the big companies, and you just listen to conversations. And people talk. I mean, people talk, and they talk outside of the secure environment. And if you transpose that to the situation that we're looking at, let's suppose that you have lots of people interacting together from all around the world. Even if they're connected to virtual Switzerland, they will be at home. Their home needs to be secure. They will be connected to their own network operator. The network operator needs to be secure. So there's a whole chain of security to maintain, which is much harder than take everybody to the UN and put them in a secure room. So that's something that needs to be considered also. Okay. And the last thing I wanted to mention is a bit borderline, is that I mentioned that the internet has infinite memory, basically. So it means that everything you say can and will be held against you. In that, let's assume that you're having a meeting with something that's not supposed to go out publicly. Okay, you cannot make sure that the peer is not going to record it or select pieces of every conversation. Okay, and also the more you send your image and you speak, the more people are going to use these images. Well, it's public people, but to create fake videos. You probably have seen all the deep fake videos. Okay, I won't run it here, but there's an interesting one on Obama and who's making a speech that makes no sense. Okay, and you can see the lips moving according to the speech and everything. So it's really impressive to see what can be done today. So that in a world where we all have our public image, especially politicians, diplomats, etc., that's something that's that also needs to be carefully addressed. Okay. So I didn't mean to frighten you. There are technical solutions to lots of things, and it's just like a game in the sense that bad people, I would say hackers, attackers, or whatever, will make a progress, then there will be a countermeasure, then there will be another progress, exploiting another vulnerability. So it's really a game that moves, forward, okay? And still digitalization, ICT has brought many opportunities. Better, more accurate data, more informed decision process, faster communications. It reduces borders and distances and everything, and it may give access to people who have trouble traveling, etc., etc. But it also creates issues. So you need trust, of course, like it was mentioned before, but trust not only in people, you need trust in systems, you need trust in your peers, of course, the people you're discussing with, but you also need trust in all the subcontractors that you will outsource your IT network, for example, or something like that. Okay, there's information remnants, so it stays on forever on the internet, and some people may cherry pick what they want to say, okay, you said this out of context. There are cyber threats which can come from individual or from governments. Okay, and there's a need for new expertise and training for users, because people don't need to be experts, but at least they need to understand the risk and understand what's okay to be done and what's not okay. And there's the last question about the digital divide also. Would a generalized virtual diplomacy, wouldn't it create some or accentuate the digital divide that already exists? And that's it. Thank you.
No. So many thanks. Very, very interesting indeed. And what you said was very much pertinent to what we discussed before. Of course, the speed of change, the fact that the internet never forgets. Yes, we think that indeed, what is one day on TV or on the screen will disappear the next day. Not true. When you highlight the power, the cost, but also the vulnerability of networks, and when you stress again, like a few of us have done tonight, the need for training, and I think that's very, 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 very true. So I would like now to have a question and answer period. But would and I see also that we have Ambassador Stevens. Yvette, we are very happy to see you again in Geneva. You've been a very proud and effective ambassador of Sierra Leone to the UN, and now you us. And possibly I'll read your question first, Yvette. While digital diplomacy will have a greater role post-COVID, it is clear it would be not wise to use it across the board due to cyber risk of hacking, including deep fake. So actually, taking over what Claude just said. Depending on the level of sensitivity and confidentiality required, some negotiation will have to be face-to-face. Could the panelists comment on this? Thank you for this question, Yvette. I don't know who would like to answer this question. Elisabeth, are you still with us? Or Jovan? Jovan? Oh, Elisabeth. This question of
well, I'm happy to leave the floor to Jovan, because I think I have already said, I think we'll have to make a distinction between sort of the routine things which will be able to be done online, where we know that we don't have complete security, and then there will be things which will have to be done the very old-fashioned way. I remember there was a famous walk in the woods in Geneva in the 1980s. In very critical situations, you may have the equivalent of a walk in the woods. And we'll, as we go on, we'll see what is very sensitive and what can be done in a more virtual way. That's what I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
That's the very clear distinction. The only problem which we are facing now is that we don't know when the context will create a trivial discussions important. And I'll give you one example. The head of public diplomacy in China, in Canadian embassy, made a photo of a new car of his ambassador, which was simple Toyota, and posted on the Weibo. Yep. And it got so-called legs in social media. It was retweeted, Weibo a million times. Well, numbers are big in China. And his ambassador was worried, and he said, what's going on? I mean, I didn't want this publicity for my car. But the reason was that a simple email of ambassador got the new car became a social media artifact where the people who criticize local authorities in China for buying expensive Lamborghini, Maserati, basically saying, look, Canadian ambassador has a simple Toyota and you have this Lamborghini. Therefore, you never know in what context even trivial things can become important. Fortunately for Canadian public diplomacy officer, central Chinese government like that message because they wanted to curb on the expenses of the cars of the local authorities. But that context is important, and this is very tricky. You can put the arrow, but you really don't know where is it going to land. And that's to add just to the ambassador's point on a clear distinction of sensitive negotiation versus regular technical ones.
Thank you, Jovan. Nick?
Yeah, maybe. I think Ambassador Stevens is right, and I think that's one of the key issues is the security. So the ICRC is involved in sometimes non-sensitive negotiations or perfectly transparent, and sometimes we're engaged in confidential bilateral dialogue over very sensitive issues. Our president is currently in the United States meeting officials there. You know that we focused on conflict environments. There are quite often a lot of things at stake. So there is no doubt that in terms of the ICRC world, and I'm sure it replicates elsewhere, you have to make a distinction between those very sensitive issues where you're literally talking about life and death, and you need to look somebody in the eye and you need to meet them and you need to build the trust. And then a lot of other diplomacy, maybe even preparatory diplomacy, which can be done virtually. And where that cursor stops, where you do one and you do the other, will relate a lot to security. And as we go along in time and there's new developments, new technology, maybe attitudes change in some way, that cursor may shift. But I think we're looking at a hybrid world. We're looking at a world where the sensitive issues remain sensitive and need to be addressed in a personal way. That would be my reading.
Oh, thank you, Nick. Very, very interesting. Because actually, Ambassador Stevens, you were not the only one. There was also a very similar question asked by Aurélie Huxley, and she said, how do we create a comprehensive framework for international actors to continue moving after the pandemic towards a virtual dialogue? But I think we already understand that virtual diplomacy is here to stay, and obviously we will use it. I don't know whether anyone would comment on Aurélie's question. If not, Claude, the last word.
Hard to say. I mean, it's hard to predict a bit.
Okay. Yeah. No, I understand. We don't have to make predictions about first when the pandemic will end, and second what will happen with virtual diplomacy. But as I think everyone said, it's quite useful. We have to learn how to use it properly, and for that we might actually learn from best practices. I don't know how international Geneva, because after all, Geneva, I don't know, we did not invent, but actually two engineers, one Brit and one French or Belgian engineer invented the web. And we have the headquarters of ITU. So definitely we have a good platform to go on with digital diplomacy. There is also ITU is also promoting artificial intelligence for good, and this is very useful. And many people come from all around the world to exchange ideas. Also, definitely also in humanitarian action, from cell phones to satellites, all those could be used. And commercial satellites and commercial cell phones could be very useful to gather data, to locate people, to locate resources, and so indeed humanitarian diplomacy could greatly benefit from technology, and I think we should not ignore this. So I think we should be very happy for this discussion, because I think it was a very rich discussion. I'm pretty sure that it's only the beginning of a discussion. I hope that with Webster, but also with other partners, and also with the UN, and possibly with ITU and others, we could have a new dialogue, and we could also deal with other issues we mentioned tonight. But on behalf of Webster University, I would like to thank everyone, including, of course, Celia, for providing the support, including all participants, and of course the speakers tonight, Ambassador Tichy-Fisslberger, thank you very much. Also Nick Hawton, thanks for taking the time from whatever is happening in the Middle East to spend some time with us. And Jovan, I hope we'll go on also this. And Claude, thank you very much for sharing, because your technical details were adding to the substance of this discussion, and I think it's very, very good. And thanks for the questions, including from Ambassador Stevens, Yvette, thanks, and also from other participants. So now I wish you a very good evening, and I hope to see you oh, excuse me, Jovan, would you like to say something? No.
No.
Saying
I'm just
goodbye.
nothing to add. I will have to leave and just waved with my birds behind as a message.
We are closing the session. No, thank you very much, Jovan, for being with us. And actually, no, thank you. I hope to see you, all of you, again, either on the screen or better face to face. And I wish you success in everything you're doing, and happiness with the springtime in the summer coming. Thank you very much. Hope to see you in soon, and my best wishes and my thanks to everyone. Thank you.
Ciao, bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.